Sure, go ahead, Alec.
Yeah,
Good to see you.
good to see you. Congresswoman Mary Miller suggested that changing Pride Month to Family Month. I would personally like to see maybe a nuclear family month. Some people are saying, let's get a Veterans Month. Does the president have any plans on making a proclamation, or is it just going to be June this year?
Well, there are no plans for a proclamation for the month of June, but I can tell you this president is very proud to be a president for all Americans, regardless of race, religion, or creed.
And that was Caroline Levitt introducing us to the concept of Nuclear Family Month in June. We'll get back to that in a minute. I'm Claire Potter.
And I'm Neil Young.
This is the Clap If You Believe in Fairies edition of our video cast. And Neil, I think you have some breaking news for us, don't you?
Yeah, this just dropped. We verified that it's accurate. Elon Musk has tweeted out, or whatever you say these days, this is what he said: time to drop the really big bomb. Donald Trump is in the Epstein files. That is that is the real reason they have not been made public. Have a nice day, DJT. So 160,000 retweets, almost 400,000 likes and counting. I guess it's his platform, so it'll probably never come down.
It probably won't. And of course he's not on drugs, because like no one on drugs would ever tweet something like that, right?
Right.
Right. Okay. Well, let's see what happens with that. I mean, like everything else crazy about this presidency, it's probably redirecting us from more important news about the budget bill, which is in terrible trouble. So we'll get to that. Neil, thank you for that breaking news. Let's start with some other stories this week. And I guess we might as well start with the budget, which is the big story of the week. The Congressional Budget Office says that the big, beautiful bill will add another $2.4 trillion to the deficit over 10 years. Before Elon Musk let us know about the Epstein files, as he left the White House, he threw a gallon of gasoline in the door and a match and labeled the big, beautiful bill a disgusting abomination. Why is Elon so angry, Neil?
I don't know. I mean, on one hand, I don't really believe that he's such a fiscal conservative that this is upsetting to him as some sort of, policy issue. Is this just some sign of, public sign of the internal fighting that was happening between him and the Trump administration, or is there something more to this, Claire? I mean, he's certainly preoccupied with this online, and I think this latest tweet is about the bill and sort of the way in which things are getting ugly between Trump and Musk. But is there something more substantive here?
Well, more substantive than drug abuse and general insanity. The only thing I could think is that Elon Musk is not used to being treated like yesterday's trash. And there's this interesting phenomenon of people who think that everything's going to be different with Donald Trump. I'm sure every one of his wives thought everything was going to be different than the last wife. And the truth is, he uses everybody and throws them away, with the possible exception of some members of his family. I do think if Elon Musk actually believed in the Doge project, and it's very difficult to know whether he did or not, because he got certain material benefits from it, like stopping investigations into his companies, like slashing regulation. If he really believed in the Doge project, then it's part of what reveals it as such a horrible failure that obviously Trump doesn't care about the budget or the deficit at all if he's willing to drive it up. In fact, Donald Trump is talking about saying we should just get rid of the budget ceiling, which was a Republican invention in the first place, right?
Yes, exactly. And I mean, there's so many different ways to take this conversation, because it really just opens up, a million issues here. Some of them are characterological, some of them, policy and historical, but they all sort of converge in the person that is Trump. And I think that it's worth just sort of stopping on the disloyalty Trump shows over and over again to people and also to policies. right?
Yeah.
That there is no core there, and that plays out in his relationships with others and also in his relationship to sort of conservative principles or conservative ideas, to sort of Republican, um, what used to be core issues. And so I think, in a way, his inconsistency is his most consistent trait. His inconsistency towards others and to sort of any sort of core belief system is. What the Republicans do here, and what Musk does here, I think is interesting because it continues to reveal the remaking that's happening on the right, that Trump has made of the Republican Party as they pass a bill like this and sort of set fire to any fiscal principles they once espoused.
Well, and I think both of us believe that this flaming pile of garbage will actually go through. I mean, the Republicans have to pass something, and their inability to do business with each other means that this bill is as good as any other bill, although any number of Republican congresspeople have come out, most notably Marjorie Taylor Greene, and said, "Oh, I didn't know I was voting for this provision or that provision, or that states would not be able to regulate AI for 10
Yeah.
years. Or, I mean, really, reading the whole 1,000 pages of this bill could be a week's worth of episodes for us, Neil.
Oh, yeah, and I mean, I don't want to pretend like every congressperson is familiar with every clause of 1,000 piece of legislation, no matter which party they belong to, but it does seem particularly, I don't know, revealing that they're willing to come forward in this moment about this bill, and of course that's just a ripe opportunity for people to make a lot of this, right? I mean, Marjorie Taylor
Right.
Greene's just been pilloried all over the place for that. Um, and yeah, I think this is going to go through, right? And I think there's also a lot that could be said about the way in which the big beautiful bill has become like the talking point on the right for talking about this. I mean, the sort of clunky way that Trump comes to talk about and name things that then becomes
Mm-hmm.
like the capitalized official terminology of conservative media and the conservative movement is its own sort of story in itself. But
Yeah.
this is a disastrous bill, right, Claire?
Totally disastrous bill. And here's something I don't quite understand. Now, I know young people don't really read anymore, but every congressperson has at least 5 assistants.
Right.
And you would think you could take 1,000 page bill and divide it up into 5 parts. Everybody reads 200 pages and flag things with a post it that might be a problem. And so either people like Marjorie Taylor Greene are lying and they knew exactly what was in the bill, or they have the laziest staffs imaginable. Because it isn't the job of the congressperson to read the whole
Right,
bill
of course.
personally. It is the job of the staff to read the bill and identify things that might be problematic in the district. And I don't understand why they're not doing this.
Agreed with that. And I also wonder, you would think that there are certain technologies in place that make this even a little bit easier for the, I mean, I know you can't
Like
necessarily.
AI, for example.
Right, right. And I guess you can't anticipate every sort of issue and then go and search for that. But also, I wonder where the lobbyists are here. And, usually they also are sort of a sounding board for
Right.
representatives, right? Like the certain lobbyists that align with them politically have let them know whether or not there's, good stuff in the bill or whatever. I do wonder again, as Trump scrambles everything, how are lobbyists acting about a piece of legislation that probably in a different time they would have had a lot to say about from a
Mhm.
business perspective, a regulatory perspective, etc. Are they just not operating in the same way because again Trump has scrambled everything and people don't really know how to respond to legislation, to the politics of the day? I don't know, but it's sort of a wild moment to have the Republican Party like signing onto this bill that A, they don't haven't really read through, and that B, I think again contains a lot of things that Republicans typically don't endorse.
Yeah, and I mean, I've gotten myself interested in the AI question. It seems to me that if first year college students can write English comp papers with AI, you should be able to feed 1,000 page bill into your computer and
Right.
ask the AI, what aspects of this bill violate states' rights?
Yeah.
What aspects of this bill would be dangerous to my banking interest or whatever? And it should be able to pop those things up. So even if your staff would rather play video games than read the bill and do their job, you should be able to find these things and respond to them.
I mean, I don't want to belabor this point, but I also think that, so much has been, I mean, this, Congress has not passed one piece of legislation
Right,
since Trump took office. It's only
right.
been executive orders, right? And in many ways, that's exactly what Trump wants, right? He wants to consolidate all power in the executive branch. And Congress has shown a willingness to go along with that, sort of in theory, but also in practice. And so, in a way, when a big bill like this shows up, isn't rubber stamping it without really any engagement with it actually what Trump wants of them? Isn't
Yeah.
this a fulfillment of the transformation of the party and of American governance that he's going after clearly and that they've signed up for? So maybe this is like them showing us exactly who they are, which we knew to be the case, but it certainly speaks to, or it certainly aligns with, I think, the sort of, you know, the Congress that just sort of signs on to anything that he wants. I mean, this is a good example of that.
Well, and you have Rand Paul fighting the good fight, but
Right.
really, where are all these budget hawks when they're supposed to be available? I agree with you completely, Neil. Um, and I guess one of the things that I wonder is, can we draw a line between Trump's own fiscal mismanagement of his business
Yeah.
and his fiscal mismanagement of national policy? Because, this is his history of spending lavishly on projects that really don't work out very well. The New Jersey Generals, his Atlantic City casinos, he's
Trump
bankrupted
University,
himself.
Trump Steaks.
Trump,
I mean, we could go
yeah,
on and on.
exactly. I mean, he's bankrupted himself several times and got to a point where he actually couldn't get loans from conventional banks. I mean, this is one of the reasons he does all this business with, the Saudi sovereign wealth
Yeah,
fund and
right.
so on and so forth. So it's odd to me. I'm sorry I'm not going to be alive in 30 or 40 years when the historians are actually digging into what happened in this moment, because I do think it's going to take that long to really figure out.
Claire, I love that you believe that there will be historians in 30 to 40 years. I'm going to just take some of that optimism and,
And archives.
oh, that too.
I mean, he keeps talking about a Trump library. It ain't going to be no Trump library.
It's
No
just going to
way.
be a big incinerator.
And that's right. Exactly. I love that. Okay, so on to the next piece of news. Very sad piece of news: an attack on Jews in Boulder, Colorado, by a deranged supporter of Palestinians in Gaza. If that incident were not bad enough, the guy made a homemade flamethrower, and fortunately, no one died, but a lot of people were very badly hurt. Now, the Trump administration has used this event to enact another travel ban on people from dominant Muslim countries entering the United States. Meanwhile, Kristi Noem's ICE has arrested and is trying to deport the assassin's wife and 5 children. This process has been paused by order of a federal judge. But I want to go back to this revived travel ban, which
Yeah.
notably does not include Qatar, Saudi Arabia, or Egypt, which is where the alleged assassin in Boulder, Colorado actually comes from. Neil, what do we make of this?
Yeah. I mean, first of all, let's just say again that this is a horrific attack, doesn't do anything to, make people in Gaza safe and secure. And it's certainly scary, the escalating violence we're seeing here that sort of looks like this. But also, this is what the Trump administration is doing over and over again, of using an opportunity like this to do something that isn't really connected to what they're saying. Especially when you point out that Egypt isn't even on this list, right?
Yeah.
You should, at least there would sort of be a logical consistency if travel from Egypt was banned or if it were included in the list. But, Trump's financial self-interest are shaping a lot of the countries that are not on this list. I don't know if that would include
Right.
Egypt. I mean, why would Egypt not be included? Is this just sloppiness of the Trump administration, or is there also some financial connection there that the Trump family is
Well, I think
involved in?
sloppiness are us. And I think one of the things that we believe is a lot of these executive orders are being drafted by AI. I mean, they're
Right.
finding errors
Yes.
in them that are typical AI errors. I think the other thing is Egypt is kind of on the table as a possible recipient of Palestinian refugees. I think we know that Trump very much wants to move everyone out of Gaza
Yeah.
to some undisclosed camp somewhere else, and Egypt has been mentioned. Egypt is adamantly opposed to this. And then redevelop the whole place into a resort, at which point the Palestinians can come back and make the beds and tend bar and sweep the streets and stuff like that. I am being sarcastic. Um, so that might be a practical reason why Egypt was left off. But honestly, I think it's just sloppy. I don't think Trump's people know where any of these people come from.
Right.
And I think, I don't want to elide the whole business of identifying entire national groups with one deranged person who is a vicious anti Semite.
Right.
I mean, I'm sort of the belief that anti Semitism is a form of mental illness anyway, because it's conspiracist, it's false, it's wrong, it relies on lies and an addiction to violence. But I think in particular, people who do things like this are mentally ill, and it has nothing to do with the national group you come from.
Yeah, and I think
So,
that, listen, I mean, the Trump administration has a lot of policy goals and on the docket, and I think in a lot of those cases, they're just waiting for an event like this to happen that gives them the
right,
slightest pretense of carrying out those actions. So, this is just the thing that lined up with them setting out to do this. They had every intention of doing this,
right,
before he was inaugurated in January. So this is, a moment in which they get to move this thing forward. I also think the AI part of this is likely very much because we've seen it
hmm
with other things. I mean, the stuff that's coming out of the FDA recently, and or rather from Secretary Kennedy, right? Like the stuff that's
hmm
making up health studies that don't even exist from
right,
medical journals that
right,
that aren't real. And I think that ongoing aspect of this administration is interesting, I guess we could say,
hmm
in light of Trump's obsession with Biden and the auto pen, right?
right,
Like, everything that Trump does is a projection. Everything is a confession.
right,
And the auto pen stuff is, I think, absolutely tied to what's happening in his administration, where he's literally signing executive orders on camera and doesn't know what they're about. Like, he's asking, what
right,
is this thing that I just signed? Like,
right,
after he signs the document, he thinks to ask a question about it, or
right.
rather he doesn't have this, the wherewithal to think not to ask the question about what the document is after you signed it. But like, all of this is connected to his absolute obsession with the Biden auto pen, which apparently he's just launched an investigation of, or at least asked for.
Can you imagine the number of people in the federal government who are engaged in investigations of things that don't matter and how
Absolutely.
futile their lives might seem? I mean, it makes grading period look like generative, exciting intellectual work. I do want to note, because we are in the middle of a big conversation about deportation, and everybody knows that Stephen Miller is very frustrated about how few people are being deported. And so they're doing things like rounding up teenage children and putting them in zip ties. And we have all kinds of film of weeping
Horrible.
children in
Yeah.
zip ties being arrested. Um, that the Modi government in India just a couple days ago rounded up thousands and thousands of Bangladeshis who they say are in the country illegally, and they have deported them to a field in no man's land between India and Bangladesh, where these people are just apparently sweltering in the sun,
Ugh.
between countries. Bangladesh won't take them back, and India doesn't want them. So they're just sitting there in this makeshift camp. And apparently, a number of people who have been arrested and pushed across the border say they're Indian. They know that their families have been in India for generations. They are not Bangladeshi, and so on. And so it does make me think that part of what the Trump administration is doing is then giving license to other countries
Yeah.
elsewhere in the world to pursue ugly, disgusting policies like
Yep.
this. Well, in other lighter news, Donald Trump has gone to war with Leonard Leo and the Federalist Society, whose recommended judges are apparently not rubber stamping the Trump power grab. Do we think Leonard Leo is hurt?
Hurt by Trump going after him?
Yes. I mean, he spent his life trying to remake the federal judiciary, and Donald Trump says, oh, it's not good enough. I don't like it. I don't like these judges, particularly Amy Coney Barrett.
Yeah, I mean, it's one thing to watch the squabble with Elon Musk. It's another thing to see this fight with the conservative judicial establishment, of which Leo is, one of the biggest luminaries. I think that this one feels like I think judicial conservatives have been the lone body of people on the right who've maintained some sort of consistency and commitment to their principles. I mean, as every other sort of demographic and group on the right has collapsed into full-on Trumpism, I think, from the legal conservatives, from judicial conservatives, we've seen some sort of commitment to principle and pushback to Trump. And Leo is, person number one in representing that. Now, what happens in the future, I think, is still an open question. Does the Federalist Society also collapse into full-on Trumpism? In a lot of ways, they've propped up, the sort of authoritarian impulses of Trump and the Trump administration, but they've shown pieces of resistance here and there. But what does it mean to put your hope in a person like this, because of what you believed he would do to the judiciary? And in a lot of ways, he carried that out in the first administration. But to see what he's doing now, I mean, all sorts of people have made their bed with Trump, and all sorts of people have reconciled themselves to him. But whether or not judicial conservatives do going forward, I think, is an open question. But I imagine the resistance is getting more and more futile even there.
Yeah, and I think, listeners, in case you're not clear what the Federalist Society does, it was formed in, I think, the late 1970s at Yale University, after a conference of conservative legal scholars, and they decided they needed an alternative to the American Bar Association. So what the Federalist Society became was both a way of nurturing conservative law and building a body of conservative law that then these judges would, bring up the chain. But it's also the case that the Federalist Society became an alternative vetting system. Every time there is a Supreme Court vacancy, the ABA sort of vets the people who are ready for that next step and sends it to the president, and then the president makes a list. Well, the Federalist Society started doing an alternative list because the ABA was, of course, too moderate, and they let liberals through and so on and so forth. And so one of the things that I think really stands out here is I don't think perhaps Leonard Leo, but certainly the people who make up the Federalist Society thought that conservative law meant abandoning the law completely.
Right.
And that is, of course, what Trump says he's going to do. He said, he's not interested in this vetting anymore. He's just going to make up his own lists from whatever, which is how we end up with Jeanine Pirro, being a district attorney again. For those of you who don't know Jeanine Pirro, she is Judge Jeanine. She is a television star. Before she was a television star, you know what her most famous prosecution was, Neil?
No, I mean, I know she was the Westchester district attorney, but what was the most
Okay, you're
famous
getting
case?
warm.
What was the most famous case?
The Martha
to come through
Moxley
there?
case. The
Oh.
Martha Moxley case. And Martha Moxley was, of course, murdered with a golf club in the woods, and it is said that one of RFK Jr.'s cousins did it.
Yes.
And he has been tried repeatedly for it. Sometimes he says he's innocent. Sometimes he says he was really drunk all the time during that period, and he doesn't really remember what he was doing. He may have even confessed to it once, but his entire adult life has been consumed with a defense against the Moxley killing. And then, of course, Moxley's mother is still waiting for someone
Yeah.
to be um, held responsible for her daughter's death. But it was Janine Pirro who did that prosecution that was then overturned. Okay, so we lost a couple people this week, and we don't normally do obituaries as part of our news, Neil, but I just wanted these people to be named. We heard today that gay writer Edmund White was dead at 85. Feelings on that, Neil?
I mean, I, he's such an important figure for LGBTQ history in the 20th century and into the 21st, certainly for LGBTQ letters. An incredibly prolific writer, an important figure just for American literature, period. I've actually only read one of his books, A Boy's Life. That's the right title.
Boy's Own Story. Yeah.
But yes.
Yeah.
Which I read right when I moved to New York, and sort of felt like one of those books you read right when you move to New York, when you're a young gay man. But I've really been touched by the New York Times did a fantastic obituary, and I've read a lot of just people's reflections and commentary, and he was a towering figure, and it's a big loss.
Yeah, he was also a very nice man. I actually met him once at a book party that was thrown for him by a friend. And he was very unassuming, very shy, very sweet. I, too, said to him, a Boy's Own Story changed my life. And he rolled his eyes. He said, everybody says that. I wish people would read my other books.
Oh.
But I've actually read a lot of his books. And of course, he lived with an HIV diagnosis for decades.
For 40 years. He was diagnosed in 1985. Yeah.
Yeah, and was one of those people who was basically saved by protease inhibitors. Yep. And apparently very sexual to the end. I mean, I read his last book, which I doubt will be his last book. I bet there's a manuscript somewhere.
Probably.
That was about sort of a resume, his sexual resume of his entire life. And it is both exhilarating and kind of appalling. I mean, it's like, I lived in New York in the 1980s. I absolutely understood that scene, and all of my friends were in it. And yet, oh my God, can you really sleep with that many men?
I mean, just reading I have not read that book, but just reading the descriptions of the book, it sounds just exhausting, but to each their own.
It is exhausting. It is exhausting, but it also takes us all back to a much earlier time where part of what it meant to come out and be proud, which is, of course, our theme today, was to share yourself romantically with other men. And there are a lot of things to be said about that. And I guess we shouldn't idealize it because there's so many different sides to such a story, but it really was a sexual revolution. It really was about sexual freedom, and it really was about taking ownership of your queer body.
Yeah.
So the other death last week when we were not on the air was radical feminist Susan Brownmiller, who died at 90. Complications of a fall. She was very old. She died in hospice. There was a really nice memorial. Friends gathered last week to tell stories about her. And as you know, Neil, I'm writing a biography of Susan. But I will say, since this is Pride Month, that one of the things people will learn from that biography is we should probably be celebrating Susan Brownmiller during Pride Month too, because she was bisexual. And she had very complicated relations to other women, but she too believed in sexual freedom and the freedom to enact your eroticism as you saw fit. So that's one of the stories I'm going to be telling about her. And, I want her on one of those signs at the Lesbian Herstory Archive that's marching down Fifth Avenue. Okay, so let's get to Pride. It's June. It's Pride Month. What does that look like in the age of Trump? Neil, let's just start with a touch of history. What's the history of Pride Month? Why do we have it?
Well, I think, everything sort of dates back to Stonewall, 1969, June. And then 1 year later, June 1970, the sort of 1 year anniversary was marked by anywhere from 3 to 5,000 people marching in New York in honor of that anniversary. It wasn't called Gay Pride at the time. It had sort of other names to sort of commemorate the Stonewall anniversary. Pride was a notion that developed early in the 1970s. Some of the sort of originators of this month and the sort of celebrations around it had toyed with the idea of like gay power. But, one of the early organizers said that power was not something that most individuals were able to have because power was about dominance and control. But pride, he thought, was something that every individual could have, and that it was also essential for LGBTQ folks, or at least, gay and lesbians, as they would have been really referred to in the day, that was something that all of them should sort of claim and own and connect to their sexuality. And those sort of early pride observations, really, and commemorations in New York City began to be copied in other places like San Francisco and Los Angeles and around Washington, D.C. and Boston, into these prides to these parades and these commemorations that really sort of focus on June, at least in the Northern Hemisphere. But there's a long history here that like really has several twists and turns, as many twists and turns as a normal parade has. And right now, I think, is a moment in which a lot of people are worried about the future of this month and what it represents, and all the ways it's threatened, both by the Trump administration, I think by, a lot of our allies backing away from this month.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think one of the things about that long history that you describe is that indeed the meaning of pride changes over time. In the 1970s, gays and lesbians are becoming more politically influential. Our colleague Timothy Stewart Winter has written a book about that in Chicago.
Yep.
But we also know that in San Francisco, where Harvey Milk is the first gay elected official who is also out, there are other gays, but he's out. It's because gay politicos are making alliances with people of color and moving certain kinds of candidates through. So in the 70s, we have politics. In the 80s, we have AIDS. In the 90s, we still have AIDS, but we also have this kind of corporate investment in gays and lesbians as customers. So it's really in the 90s and the early 2000s that we begin to see groups like Citibank investing in the parade and having the celebrations get bigger. I mean, I remember the first Pride I marched in, we marched up Fifth Avenue. And that was sort of the revolutionary thing to do, was to march up, including my friend Anthony Bartlemay, who was a teaching assistant at the time at Yale, who gathered us all together and shepherded us to the event. And we all marched with gay teachers. And he instructed us that when we marched past Bergdorf's, we all had to bow down. So there was a kind of fun campiness to it. In the 1980s, there was a kind of grimness to it. I always marched with ACT UP in the 1980s. And Larry Kramer would be marching up and down the line, shouting at everybody and so on. But really, by the 2000s, it wasn't just that I got older. It was the corporate quality of it. It was very much about, the bars and the restaurants and the sponsors and the dance and so on. And so I kind of lost interest. I'm beginning to think, some of us elders need to start reclaiming and getting back into it. The Trump administration will not be making an official announcement this month for Pride Month, as Caroline Levitt indicated at the top of the show. Instead, they've chosen to use June to attack and erase LGBT people. The Department of Education has declared June to be Title IX month. Neil, will you explain to any of our listeners who don't understand why it's Title IX month instead of Gay Pride Month?
Well, I actually don't know why June would be Title IX month. Is there a reason for?
Ah, there is a reason. It's an
Okay,
attack on transgender people
got it. Okay. Oh,
because
I didn't know if there was a date though in the month but
right,
no, they're just taking the opportunity. Like this is men, these are women. This is a moment in
right,
which like the sort of binary gender is
right,
codified into
right,
law,
right,
and
right.
I mean it is fascinating watching conservatives, if that's what we're calling them these days, Republicans, all of a sudden become huge backers of Title IX in
Oh,
itself, right?
oh, yeah, women's sports as
Mm,
if they really care,
yeah,
right? Yeah, I agree. And I think, what is an interesting twist, and I want to land on this for a couple of minutes because one of my big criticisms of Pride celebrations is how corporate they've become. I
yeah,
mean, is it a form of revolution to be gay and working at Citibank? And yet, Citibank every year would put together these floats where all of their gay employees would march down Fifth Avenue waving flags and so on. Well, according to Judd Legum at Persuasion, 19 corporations have pulled their support for Pride, including Lowe's, Nivea, Capital One, Citibank, MasterCard, and Disney. And obviously, there's a bunch more. Is there some way in which corporations pulling back from Pride could actually strengthen an LGBT political movement?
absolutely. I mean, I think there's a way this sort of critique of the corporatization of Pride Month, and I think of just sort of LGBTQ existence in general has been 2 decades going on. And I think it's really most manifest in Pride Month when you, like you say, you go to the parade and you see, a Starbucks float followed by a Chase float, followed by a Citibank float, and you think, what in the world is this all about? Um, and that, like, that sort of, dominance of capitalism in a parade like this has crowded out an LGBTQ politics and community that might look differently if those actors weren't there, and that
Yeah.
the politics might be different. That said, I think as the piece points out that you just mentioned, there's a $750,000 budget shortfall for the New York Pride
Right.
Parade because of the withdrawal of these corporate sponsors, and the same in case in many of these other big cities. I mean, these are multi-million-dollar events that relied on corporate sponsorships
Right.
to take place. Now, can those events take place and do so on a different budget and look different? Maybe, and that's something for organizers to think about. And again, I think probably a lot of critics that would say that like that big budget wasn't worth the sort of relationship with these big, Fortune 500 companies.
Right.
But I think that it is possible to imagine a different political movement and a political future without such actors involved. And also, I think one can also imagine a very concerning future in which corporate allies are not at the table,
Right.
and are not advocating and fighting for and defending rights as the Trump administration goes after them. So we know that the history, I mean, especially if you look at the history of the legalization of same sex marriage, Wall Street money and Fortune 500 corporate presence was essential to both sort of financing the movement,
Hmm.
but also I think shaping the hearts and minds of American people who really have their hearts and minds shaped through consumer culture in this country. I mean, that's just a
Yeah.
basic fact. So I don't think it's a good thing for corporations to retreat around this issue, even as one can acknowledge the real downsides of having Pride Month be overly corporatized over the last 2 decades.
Yeah, I think that's right. And, I think you talked about Pride could look very different. And in fact, in many places, it does look very different. I
Absolutely.
mean, here in Northampton, Massachusetts, they actually have their Pride Parade in May for reasons that are a little mysterious to me. But really, Pride is for the children. We
Mm-hmm.
have so many gay and lesbian families here, so many trans people, and so on and so forth, that a lot of it is for, as they call them, the gaybies, the kids of gay families to sort of be with other kids of gay families, but it's also a very enthusiastic embrace of the community of a particular segment. But it's, it's sort of like a tatty little parade with a nice fair at the end of it where you can buy tchotchkes and, rainbow sweaters and stuff like that. But it also looks very different in Brooklyn and in Queens
Yeah.
and in Staten Island. So pride parades, honestly, I don't think the people that my nephew is marching with in Brooklyn are the same people who are marching in Manhattan anymore.
Yeah.
So looking to the margins a little bit and reimagining the pride celebration around that could be a big step forward in my view.
I love that you say that and draw attention to it, because it makes me think about in June 2019, my husband and I and our dog drove across the country from New York City to Los Angeles, but we sort of took the long route. We spent 3 weeks doing it, and we went up through the Dakotas and across Wyoming and Idaho, and it wasn't planned at all. It just happened to be 3 weeks in June, and
Right.
this was 2019 also, so still in the first Trump administration, and it was the most heartening experience to drive through these small towns and mid-sized towns of like Sioux City and Cedar Rapids and Bozeman, Montana, and to see, and just we kept on coming across their pride events,
Oh, that's
and
so
it was
great.
so beautiful to see what felt really homespun in a lot of ways, and
Mhm.
really just on such a different scale, but also in these places that one doesn't really imagine, frankly, a queer community. Or I don't, with all my sort of East Coast biases, but to see the sort of really simple parades with just a bunch of convertibles and maybe a fire truck, and just like
Yeah.
people have, made their own signs, and they hung up a flag in their shop in these sort of small and mid-sized towns across, the American plains and the Northwest, was so beautiful and actually really inspiring and touching at a time like that. And also, I think, as you say, provide a different model of how this all could be observed and celebrated.
Well, and leaping off that, that is the kind of thing that Republican legislatures are now trying to stamp out. There are bills in over a dozen legislatures right now that seek to ban the display of pride flags on government property. Utah has already passed such a law. The governor has signed it, which means not just state government property, but say, the police station in Sioux City or so on. Any publicly owned building cannot display a pride flag, cannot acknowledge its own LGBT employees, and certainly can't acknowledge the LGBT people around them. It'll be interesting to see what happens when one of these laws makes it to the Supreme Court, as it inevitably will, because
Right.
it is, I think, a free speech issue. But what is the interest of state Republican parties of telling little towns that they can't celebrate Pride?
I mean,
Because
this is,
actually, that's happened in Florida.
yeah, it has. And, there are towns that are resisting. Boise, Idaho apparently has its pride flag up at City Hall or one of the government buildings, and the mayor there. I mean, Boise
Mhm.
is a very gay friendly town. A lot of these cities, in these red states, like the capital cities or the largest cities, have very gay friendly reputations, and there's a tension there obviously with this legislation. But I think like it's an interesting question about especially these small towns, and like, why is DeSantis going after Eustis, Florida, or DeLand doing something like this in this little observation? I think the larger project is about the erasure of us. That's
Yeah.
really what the goal is here. And there's different ways at which you can get at this. I mean, the trans issue has been a very successful front for this movement. But I think, going after pride representation and flags is another way at getting at this. And that the ultimate goal is the erasure of us, the disappearance of
Yeah.
us. And I think that's going to happen on many different fronts. I do agree that will probably get to the Supreme Court. No idea how the Supreme Court would rule on such a case, because it seems like such a clear, First Amendment case. But again, there's no predictability with how any courts are going to
Right.
rule in this moment.
Well, and as you point out, in the face of this hostility, there are some small towns in red states that have actually chosen this as the first year to hold their first Pride celebrations.
Right.
So we're beginning to see at least some cultural pushback, if not
Hmm.
political pushback. Um, we've also seen, and it's interesting. I got into an online conversation with a guy named David Marcus, who writes for the Fox News website, and he tweeted about Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, who is planning to strip a Navy ship of its name, the USS Harvey Milk. I want to point out to our listeners that Harvey Milk was, in fact, a Navy veteran. He
Right.
was actually kind of a conservative guy who went to work in finance. By the time he ends up in San Francisco, he's independently wealthy, opens a camera shop, and that camera shop becomes the base of his political power on Castro Street. But what Marcus was saying was, this is totally appropriate to take this name off the ship. It doesn't belong in the ship. And I tweeted back something like, you know, because homophobia is fine now, right? Or something like that. And we went back and forth a few times. And what he ended with, which I thought was so interesting, was he said, well, I'm not saying Harvey Milk's name shouldn't be on something, just not on this.
Okay.
And I said, well, why not on this? He's a Navy veteran. There's a John L. Lewis ship. Why not Harvey Milk? And he said, well, because it's provocative.
Mm,
And I think this is a little key into where we are going with homophobia right now, Neil, which
absolutely.
is, go ahead and be gay, be a lesbian, be bi, whatever you do, but please, I don't want to see you. We are entering a new don't ask, don't tell moment in our history,
Completely.
in which we're not necessarily being recriminalized, but we are being pushed to the margins. And as you're saying, they don't want to see us anymore.
Right. And any identification of such is a provocation, right? And this,
Right.
I mean, I wouldn't say it started with, but like, let's put some other examples in play here. I mean, stuff, happening in Florida that included that teachers couldn't have a photo of their, same sex partner on their desk because
Right.
the mere fact of the relationship that would be only acknowledged by a small, photo, let alone saying anything about, your husband or your wife, to your students, it's that is a provocation. And I think like that language is so revealing. It's so important that you just like put your finger on it because it's going to be the discourse going forward that, again, sets in relief the larger sort of political project of erasing any sort of representation,
Hmm.
which is essential to also removing rights.
Yeah,
And I
I
think,
think that's right.
this thing with milk is so interesting too to see how it's playing out online. I thought you were going to say something different because the thing I've been observing is this a lot of, again, conservatives, Twitter, like Trumpy folks on Twitter are saying over and over again, Harvey Milk had a relationship with a teenage boy. A pedophile should not have his name on, a
Right.
ship. Now, I don't know the history there. I mean, is that accurate, Claire? I don't know if it is or not. But like what they also seem to say is this is the perfect storm that we have set up, the trap that the left is walking into, because by removing this name, it's forced them to defend him, and then we can, they're literally saying this online, and then we can point
Wow.
out that he's a pedophile and game over. And so that's sort of like, this is all like the game in place, and liberals are falling right into it. That's a big online conversation I've
Right.
been seeing.
That's interesting. I do not recall Harvey Milk having had a relationship with a teenager. I would have to say, if he did, that was not unusual for gay people or straight people in the 1970s. And it's still not unusual for straight people. I'm seeing a lot of sort of homophobic tweeting. Like one guy was like, well, the ship probably just carries lubricants the around the Pacific. And I tweeted back, no, actually, it's bringing lubricants to your wife.
Yeah,
And
because
he just
heterosexuals
fucking
don't.
lost it.
Yeah, yeah.
Just lost it. So anyway, yeah, I mean, it'll be interesting to see how this plays out. It will also be interesting to see, since of course the Supreme Court term is ending, although sometimes they extend into July now. Um, because we are awaiting Supreme Court decisions in the Tennessee case banning transgender care for minors, and a Maryland case in which the plaintiffs wish to assert the right to prevent their children from learning about LGBTQ people. That's Mahmoud, which we did a story about. So we may be celebrating Pride Month with two ugly Supreme Court decisions as well.
Yeah, I don't
All
think
right.
the question is only, if those are released in June, not whether or not the court decides.
If
what
I
it
were the
decides.
court, I would wait till July. I mean, they often have to wait until July anyway, because for some reason they cannot keep up with the work they're doing. I guess it's because there's so much on the shadow docket now. But they have gone well into July for the last couple of years. So if I were them, I would just boot these till July. So let's get to the happy part of the program, Neil. What we want to go viral. What do you
Yeah,
want to go viral this week?
what I want to go viral is this piece. I think it came out just this morning in The Atlantic. Yep, it did. By Michael Sokolov. When My Teacher Made Me Pray. Subtitle of it is I was the only Jewish kid in my class and I felt like an outcast. This is a piece that talks about Sokolov having grown up in the suburbs of Philadelphia in the 1960s, right around the time of the two Supreme Court decisions in 1962 and 1963 that made school prayer and Bible reading in the public classrooms unconstitutional. And he talks about how he grew up as like the only Jewish family in this very Catholic suburb of Philadelphia, and that how after the Supreme Court decisions in his class, they continued to hold morning prayer, and that the teacher instructed them to pray for the overturning of the Supreme Court decision and to pray
Wow.
for the legal return of school prayer to their classroom. And just, like how uncomfortable that was for him as a young person. I'm a historian who's written a lot about the history of school prayer, so I know that those Supreme Court decisions, as many historians have written about, did not end school prayer or Bible reading. Those continued very much so in public school systems, particularly in the Midwest and the South, well into the 70s and even into the 80s. But the other thing that's happened, and I've written about this, is like, especially in the 90s and 2000s, school districts found workarounds. So, okay, we can't have a school prayer to start the day or a Bible reading to start the day, but we can allow it at sporting events or at extracurricular activities after the official end of the school day. And that those have been upheld by courts over and over again. So there's a lot more Bible reading and school and prayers happening sort of in school spaces, in public school spaces throughout the nation, period. But the author Sokolov brings us to our current moment and reminds us that there's a lot of things happening right now that look much more like that sort of political fight for school prayer that's been going on for decades. So
Right.
in Texas, the governor, I'm blanking on what they've actually done. They have, I believe, there's a court case right now that they will likely win. I'm trying to find it. Oh, yes. Governor Greg Abbott is expected to sign legislation requiring classrooms in the state's 9,000 public schools to be postered with copies of the Ten Commandments. Earlier this year, teachers in Oklahoma were ordered to keep a Bible in their classroom. Every single teacher in every classroom in the state will have a Bible in the classroom, the state superintendent said. So these sorts of things are happening that feel like much bigger steps forward and sort of restoring school prayer than the sort of stuff I was talking about happening in the 90s and the 2000s. The one other thing that I will say is, as I've written about this in the past, the way that this has broken apart politically, time and time again, has been not because like secular atheists have risen up and have mounted a successful case from the ACLU. It's because other religious people have objected. Those have typically been Catholics and Mormons, who have been most organized around this, who don't want evangelical prayers happening, their Mormon children or the Catholic children having to do sort of evangelical prayers. But they've also often joined in alliance with Jewish families, with Hindu and Muslim, to make religious objections to any sort of legislation that's happening. That was successful in the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s. I do not know, A, if that will happen in our current political moment, or B, if it were, if it would be successful. Because I think, again, everything's being scrambled now. We have different, people in bed with each other. And I don't know if there is a sort of religious conservative objection to school prayer in the way that we've seen it historically from non-evangelical religious actors. We shall see. But anyway, it was a really great piece, sort of a blending of memoir and current news events, and it was in the Atlantic. We'll link to it.
I am really looking forward to reading it, Neil. I actually remember when I was in middle school or something, we got a new head of school, and the first all school assembly she led, she began with a prayer. And that was actually when I was still going to church, but I was a Presbyterian, and I knew she was an Episcopalian. And first of all, it's not the kind of thing a Presbyterian would ever do in a secular setting, but it felt coercive to me. I had no objection to religion. That was what I did on the weekend. I sang in the church choir and so on and so forth. But school was not the place that I wanted to share religion with people. And so even as a Christian, I felt coerced by it. And so, but I think what you're saying that's really interesting here is there is continuity between the Supreme Court decision that ends school prayer and the present, which is it didn't end school prayer.
That's right.
It continued in other ways. So I'm looking forward to reading that, Neil, and listeners will link to it in the show notes as always. So what I want to go viral this week, Neil, and actually I want you and Nate to do whatever you can to go see it. The new production of Gypsy, directed by George C. Wolfe, with Audra McDonald in the role of Mama Rose. Okay, so I do this thing with Broadway where like 45 minutes before the show starts, I go online and find a single seat, which means the prices have dropped dramatically. So I got a seat in the second row of the Winter Garden Theater to see Audra McDonald in Mama Rose. And Gypsy is not one of my favorite musicals, but I heard good things about it. And I love Audra McDonald. And, she's got this Juilliard trained voice. And as a production, it made me think differently about race blind casting. Because, we had that whole conversation around Hamilton. And as you know, Renee and I did a book about it.
Yep.
And why it matters. The reason it matters in Gypsy is it actually bends the musical to a whole different story without changing anything. So Audra McDonald is Mama Rose, and there are two children, one of whom is Louise and one of whom is June. And June is very light-skinned with blonde curls. Louise is very dark. And so June is clearly the child of one of Mama Rose's marriages, we presume, to a white man, because she's involved with a white man in the show. Spoiler alert for everyone, baby June runs away with another dancer. But before she runs away, there is this moment of truth in which a big theater entrepreneur wants to hire baby June, train her, send her to theater school and so on. His only condition is that Mama Rose goes away. Now, in the original musical, we know it's because Rose is an overbearing mother. She has to run everything. But at that moment, I'm like, oh no, he needs Mama Rose to go away, because then if she doesn't, everybody would know June is Black.
Right.
And then, of course, when June runs away, it's pretty clear that June is going to go to live white, that she will shed her Blackness to become the actress that she wants to be. And then, of course, Louise, who is very Black, becomes a stripper. And she becomes a stripper in this hugely cosmopolitan way. It's very European. She's taking French lessons. She has minks and so on. She's not your average stripper. And, there's a whole scene in the burlesque theater where that's when they all hit bottom, is when the only place they can be booked is in burlesque. But that's the beginning of Louise's life. And first of all, Audra McDonald is great. There is a kind of agony to her singing. Everything's Coming Up Roses isn't a happy song. It's a desperate song.
Yeah.
And then, of course, Rose's song at the end, she's basically having a breakdown. And it's not just because she's lost her daughter, and it's not because she's not the star anymore. It's because she has basically sold her black daughter into into the stripper trade. It's an astonishing show. It's astonishing in the ways that it takes a relatively ordinary musical and makes something extraordinary out of it. And Audra McDonald is fantastic. I can't believe that she does what she does for 8 performances a week. And
Yeah.
when you and Nate go and see it, because you have to promise me you're going to go see it, you will know exactly what I'm talking about. So I want it to go viral. I'm sure at some point there will be some kind of television production for those who can't see it. Hot recommend the new
Well,
production of
I
Gypsy
mean,
on Broadway.
yeah, that sounds amazing. I mean, I'm hearing all the things, and I think everyone knows she's going to win the Tony, and it's a foregone
Yeah.
conclusion. This is one, being called one of the greatest Broadway performances ever. I, like you, do not really like Gypsy. Like, it's a tough musical.
Yeah.
I saw it I was just looking it up. I saw Bernadette Peters do it
Oh, wow.
back in 2003. And, she was also incredible, but like, it's a tough show to watch. But
Yeah.
all the things you say about the nuances are just the different sort of meanings that can come out of it by this casting change, and the ways in which that sets the stories, the same script, the same music, into sort of different interpretive realms is really interesting. And I mean, we would all, I think, see Audra McDonald sing the phone book. So yeah, I hope we'll get to see it. We'll be in the city in August, so hopefully she's still doing this then.
Do it, or come in specially, stay in our apartment, whatever. I mean, and I think the big takeaway for me, which was the surprise insight, is there is no such thing as colorblind casting. There's only casting that makes us think about color.
Oh, yeah.
And I do. Weirdly, a bunch of my friends were there that night. My friend Barbara Savage was there. Thaddeus Davis was there. 2 historians. As it turns out, Annette Gordon-Reed was somewhere in the audience
Wow.
too. I know, it was astonishing.
What a
We
night.
should have been a seminar, but I got to talk to Barbara about it afterwards. And one of the things we agreed on was that it's the kind of production where a white audience from the suburbs could just go home and say, "Oh, I just saw a great production of Gypsy," and every black person in the audience absolutely knew what they were watching, which was a story about race in America, cloaked in Gypsy.
Amazing.
All right, Neil, we've had a big afternoon, and I look forward to seeing you next week, my friend.
Sounds good. Take care.